All right, thank you guys for joining me today. Again, my name is Travis Legleiter at the University of Kentucky. And what I want to do today is I want to cover residual herbicides and multi-site of action residual herbicides and their length of activity. So the way I wanted to kind of tackle this today is kind of go back to the basics, and any good report kind of covers who, what, when, where, and why. So that's kind of how I wanted to tackle this today. And we'll spend the first part of this really just talking about residual herbicides in general in soybean, and then we'll get to the multiple site of action products. So just to kick it off, what is a residual herbicide? So it's any herbicide with an extended period of activity in the soil. So any herbicide we apply and it has activity within the soil to suppress or control weeds as they emerge for an extended period of time. If we're talking soybean, we're typically thinking 2 to 6 weeks, give or take a little bit. That's usually what we're targeting as far as that extended period of activity. So that is what a residual herbicide is, really quite basically and in a nutshell. So why? I mean, we've had the Roundup Ready to Extend soybeans for 5 years now, or going on 5 years. The Enlist soybeans for several years, the LLGTs or the GT27 soybeans. And then just last year, we got the Extend Flex soybeans. So we've got all of these post-emergence options. Why do we need a residual? I mean, why do we need it? And simple answer is, even with all those technologies, we still have weeds, right? The weeds are still there. We're getting reports, and I've visited fields. I think most all weed scientists have probably visited fields at this point in time where we're starting to see some failures of these post herbicides. So even though we have all these great varieties with these post-emergence tolerance traits, we're still struggling at places. And as we continue down the road, I think we're going to see more and more of these struggles. And that's really why we need residual herbicides, because those are helping us out quite a bit. Okay, so just to kind of go a little bit further with that. So we're really wanting to reduce the reliance on our post applications. That's really what we're wanting to do. We've all heard about the herbicide shortages. We're all talking about it. That's another good reason. Most of the shortages are with post-emergence herbicides that we're hearing about. So that's, again, another reason you need residuals. Increasing the number of site of action. So, one of the pillars of Take Action is using more sites of action within our acreage, within our programs, to reduce or mitigate the selection of resistance. So if you use residual herbicides, that gives you several additional sites of action that you can get worked into that program. And it, again, increases the flexibility of those post applications, and we're controlling the weeds at the weakest point. So to kind of dig into that just a little bit, here's a picture of a trial. This was actually in Indiana, where multiple residual herbicides were applied, and then some of the plus didn't get any residual at all. So you can see here, you can see the difference. You can see the little squares throughout, right? The little rectangles. You can see the ones that have residual herbicides, and you can see the ones that most certainly did not. And then there's some that are kind of in the middle, right? And when we talk about coming back and making a post application, this was 3 or 4 weeks after the pre's went on. I can tell you which fields I would want to deal with, right? And you can choose yourself as well. But most of us want those fields that are really clean or just have a few weeds. And those are the fields with the residual herbicides. And those give us a lot more ability, a lot more flexibility within our post-emergence applications, and it buys us time. That's really the kind of the big thing there. And we're controlling the weeds at their weakest points. So we have all these publications with Take Action that focus in on single weeds. And if you pick up any of them that are dealing with our annual weeds, every one of those is going to point to a lot of the biology that makes these weeds really difficult. And it largely has to do with their vegetative states and the reproductive states. But all of their weaknesses for our annual weeds is when they're emerging, right? That's when they're at their weakest, and that's their weak point. And anytime you want to defeat something, if you want to be serious about it, you're going to have to attack it at its weakest point. And so if you're using residual herbicides, you're attacking those weeds at their weakest point at this point in time. So that's another good reason of why we want to do that. So then the question comes up, okay, we told you why, but when should I be putting my residuals on? And this is always a big discussion. And so the things we need to look at, or things we need to think about, is, when is that problematic weed emerging? When's your critical weed free period? And you need to think about, do I also need in-season residuals? And also thinking about activating rainfall events, because our pre's do need to be activated. And that's probably the hardest one to hit, because we can't control the weather, but it's really just looking at forecasts and making sure we do have some activating rainfall events, or trying to get that in before those events occur. But to dig into these a little bit more, when you ask me when should that residual be put on, I'm going to ask you the question of, what weeds or what are the problematic weeds you're trying to go after, right? So for most of our annual weeds or summer annual weeds like palmer or water hemp there at the top and top left, those are weeds that are coming up, right around the same time as we're planting or our soybeans are emerging. So we really want our residuals on at that time. Whereas something like morning glory is something that comes up a lot later in the season. So we may not even have residuals that can really get to that because it comes up so much later. So a lot of it's asking, when is that problematic weed coming up? And again, going back to those tech action publications will help you with figuring out when that's coming up. And that really dictates when should we be using that residual herbicide. So the other thing to think about is, when is our critical weed-free period? So this is just an example chart of critical weed-free period. And basically, this is the period of time within our cropping season when it's critical to keep that crop weed-free. And this is done, the way we create these is we have plots that we allow the weeds to grow, and then we remove the weeds at certain time points. And that's the green line or the removal point. And the red line is you're keeping that plot weed-free up to a certain point and then letting it go. And that's the red line. So basically what you do is you take where those intersect and where they get up to that optimal weed free or the optimal maximum yield, and you just color in that section like you see there in blue. And that's our critical period where we need to be weed free. So that's when we need to be making sure we're doing our post applications, we're keeping that field as clean as we can. So if you kind of look at that and think about that weed free period within that example is about 3 weeks. If you think I'm going to do a nothing but post application, I'm not going to put down a residual. Typically, that's going to put you in there putting on your post application to 4 to 6 inch weeds somewhere around 3 weeks. In some scenarios, it might actually be 2 weeks before you've really even gotten into your critical weed free period. And then as soon as you put that on, within a couple of days or a couple, within a week, if there's no residual with that post, your weeds are going to start emerging again. And so then that's where you see that red line starts to tick back off again, because you have weeds starting to compete with your crop. Whereas if you would have used a residual, that's where you have this green line. That residual is going to keep you weed free up to, 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks till you have to make that post application. And then with that post application, you're putting that post application further into your critical weed-free period. So that's why we want those residuals on and put them on really at planting. Now, the other thing that you can do, we talked about in-season residuals, and that's with that application, that post application, you put on another residual. And basically what that's going to do is it gives you longer weed-free period, and that's going to pull that green line back up to that optimal yield for maybe another 2 or 3 weeks, or until we're getting closer to crop canopy, which is the goal with soybean and weed control. So that's the reason we want residuals and when we want residuals, we really want it on early in the season, protecting the soybeans early in the season during that critical weed-free period. Okay. So then which actually should probably be but where can you find these products, or which products should you use? That's really what we're asking here. And there's lots of residual herbicides available to you, and numerous options are a good thing. It's a good thing that you guys have lots and lots of options. We're not going to go through all those options today. Basically, what I'm going to say is almost every state has a weed control guide from your land grant university. Find that guide, and it's going to really give you the guidance for your state of which herbicides you have as far as the residuals and which ones you can use for control. So make sure you check those out. Okay. So again, just to generally cover what's going to be in these residual herbicides, what groups are going to be in here, because we talked about site of actions and having multiple sites of action. So within your residual herbicides for soybean, some of them are going to have group 2s, your ALS inhibitors. A lot of times the group 2s get discounted simply because we do have ALS resistant weeds. Some of our problematic weeds like the amaranths and the ragweeds have ALS resistance, and even some of our grass species have ALS resistance. So that's why they get discounted a lot, but they're still useful against a lot of our weeds and across a wide weed spectrum. So if you have a group 2 within your residual, keep it in there. It is helping you. You may not be realizing it, but it is helping you. You have group 5s. Again, this is an example where if you use a residual, you can get in a site of action group into your soybean rotation that you can't get in post-emergence. So metribuzin, we can apply it pre, but you can't apply it after the weeds are up, or after the soybeans are up. So that's an example where you can introduce another site of action into your soybean. The group 14s have been very popular within our residuals. Usually it's going to be flumioxazin or sulfentrazone. You may also have fomesafen, which has residual activity. Saflufenicil, that's going to be a product that we have to put it on at a little bit higher rate to really get the residual out of it. But if you do, you can get some residual out of that. The group 3s, these are probably used more in southern geographies, but they're still effective as a residual herbicide. Pendimethalin is probably the best example of those. And then the group 15s, ones that we rely on quite a bit, that's going to be things like acetochlor, dimethamid P, S-metolachlor, and pyroxasulfone. These are most well known for their control of small seeded broadleaves and grasses. So there's lots of options out there. Again, go to those weed control guides or go to the herbicide classification chart, and you can find all these possible products out there that have these sites of action in there. And again, the goal for us really is to really strive to get a residual that has multiple sites of action. And when we talk about multiple sites of action, we really want a herbicide that has multiple effective sites of action. So what I'm showing you here now is a table, and this is all the herbicides that are available, or the majority of them that are available to you, where they have multiple sites of action in them that are effective against water hemp and palmer. So I'm gonna start focusing a little bit more on water hemp and palmer because we've got some good data on that, and those are the ones we struggle with the most, I believe. But with those weeds, we have 3 sites of action that are really still quite effective as residuals. So group 14s, that's your PPO inhibitors, your group 15s, your very long chain fatty acid inhibitors, and your group 5s, which is going to be metribuzin. So this list is all the products that have at least 2, if not 3, of those sites of action packed into a single product, okay? And you'll notice some of those, like Fierce XLT or Panther Pro or Trivents, had those asterisks there. They also have some ALS inhibitors with them, which is fine, okay? Again, those ALS inhibitors are helping us with all of the other weeds. So what I'm really trying to show you here is you have lots of options. So there's 19 here. I believe I'm missing 2 or 3. So you have over 20 options out there. So you pick the one that fits your program the best. So why do we really want these residuals to have multiple sites of action? Okay, so let's break this down. This is a water hemp study that we did here in Kentucky. And so what we had is you had Zidua, which just has a group 15, so just a single site of action as a residual. Fierce XLT has a 14 and 15 and 2, so that's 3 sites of action. But again, remember, most of our water hemp is ALS resistant, so we only consider that as 2 effective sites of action, so a group 14 and a group 15. An Intimidator that has 3 effective sites of action, a 14, a 15, and a 5. So you have 1, 2, and 3, and then the untreated, so this received no residual at all, okay? So we just picked these products because they're the products that we had on hand. Again, you go to that chart, you can find any of those products that are out there, right? So there's more than these, but these are the ones we found that we could use. So looking there, Taylor County, you can see 3 weeks after the pre-application, everything's 95 to 97% control. That's good, right? 3 weeks out, that's what we're expecting. And we probably got another couple of weeks, and compared to the untreated that had no control at all. So that was covered up with weeds. So that's why we want residual herbicides. And in this case, you might be looking at me and going, well, why did I spend the extra money on that product that had 2 and 3 sites of action when the one with 1 did just as well as the others, right? You're asking me that, and that's just one field, one scenario, and we see that happen quite a bit. But there's also scenarios like Caldwell County there on your right, where you can see the Fierce XLT and the Intimidator are significantly better than the Zidua. But yet that Zidua, still a 72% control 21 days out, and that's a whole lot better than the untreated. And you may be looking at that and going, wait a second, that's 9% control. How did that happen? That happened because we had already made our post-application a couple of days before that. So we didn't even get to 3 weeks before we had to make that first post-application. Whereas the rest of these, whether it was 1 site of action, 2 or 3 sites of action, it got us another couple of weeks beyond that. And you can see here where those multiple sites of action are buying us maybe another week, if not another 2 weeks in some scenarios. Here's another case. This is on Palmer Amaranth. Okay, so you have 14 days. The 14 DA pre, that's 14 days after the pre-application went on, and then the 21 days after the pre-application went on. Same setup. You have the different levels of residuals with the different amounts of sites of action in them, and then the untreated. So if you look at the 14 days after the pre-application, all of those residuals look good, 99 to 100% control. And that's great. And you compare that to the untreated with 0% control, we all know where we want to be. Now, the thing I'll point out is at 14 days after pre, in the untreated, treated, it's 0% control, and those weeds were all at 4 inches. We had to spray it 2 weeks after planting, in this case with the Palmer Amaranth. They got to 4 inches very quickly. So by the time you got to 21 days pre, that's why you see the 88% control there, because the post had gone on, okay? But even at that, it's still having 2 and 3 sites of action in our residual still gave us better control than having that post application on. And we still had not made a post application. You can see the Zidua had separated itself out, or it's a little bit less control, but still 90% is good considering the fact that we did not have a post application on that field. And the reality is, when it came down to it, by time we got to the point where we did need to make the post application on those plots that had residuals, we are already needing to make our second post application on that one that did not receive a residual. So residuals buy you time. Using multiple sites of action can buy you 1 or 2 more weeks than if you just have one side of action in your residual. Okay, so that's what we're really trying to drive home here. Now, the next question that comes up is, okay, I'm going to use multiple sites of action in my residual, but when should I put all that on? When and where, right? So, because we talked about the lay-by residuals, do I really need a lay-by residual or not? Okay, so here what we're doing is we looked at water hemp populations, and we went to the end of the season. Yeah, the top line is multiple sites of action. So this is a residual with multiple sites of action, such as that Fierce or Intimidator or any of those other 19, followed by a single site of action lay-by. That would be a group 15, okay? And then looking at, I put on all my residual sites of action at planting, and that's it. Or I put on just one single side of action at planting, and then I put the rest of my residual on at lay-by. So I'm kind of splitting it up. And then the last line there is single side of action pre. So I'm putting on only one side of action residual pre-emergence, and then that's it. And then all of these got followed by post-emergence applications, depending on the soybean trait, and timed it to 4 to 6 inch weeds. So when every treatment got to 4 to 6 inch weeds, we sprayed it. Okay. So this is end of the season. I'm actually going to talk about Taylor County first, there on your right. And you can see there at the end of the season, our water hemp densities were all the same. Didn't matter which residual program we used, all the same. And again, you're going to look at me and go, then why would I spend money on multiple sites of action? You got to think about it long term. It can't just be short term, and it can't just be one field. You got to look at the big picture, and that big picture comes in more frame when you look there at Caldwell County, and you can see that single site of action residual program. It's still a whole lot better than doing nothing, because you can see down there at the bottom, those had 237 plants per 7 meters squared, but the single side of action did not do as good a job as if we did put in multiple sites of action within our residual packages. And how we split that up didn't really make a difference at the end of the day, but that's why we drive home using multiple sites of action within our residual programs in our soybeans. Okay, so cases like Caldwell County is why we really drive that home. So lastly, what I'll do here is who should be using residual herbicides. So who should be using them? If you're a farmer that grows soybeans and you have a complete mess of weeds, or if you're a farmer that just has a few weeds, or maybe you have completely clean fields and maybe 1 or 2 escapes, and I forgot the picture of a completely clean field here. But basically, if you're growing soybeans, you need to be using residual herbicides. That's the bottom line. It doesn't matter what your overall weed pressure is. You need to be using residual herbicides. Time it to when your problematic weeds are emerging, and pick the residual herbicides that are going to maximize your control on whatever weeds are within your field. So that's what I have today. Thank you guys for joining me.